Don't let your justified hatred of Keir Starmer fool you. Boris Johnson is the worst Prime Minister we've ever had. He inflicted the greatest betrayal on Britain in the form of the Boriswave, importing about 4 million immigrants over the space of 4 years under his government and the subsequent governments due to the policy changes that he introduced, he was advised against doing, and remains unrepentant for to this day. And so I can't think of anyone I would less like to hear from at this time. Yet he still enjoys a column in the Daily Mail, for which he is paid handsomely for, and in the last week he wrote that falling birth rates aren't a disaster, they're the best bit of global news in a long time. Now you can imagine the comments beneath this ex-post, we'll look at a few in a moment, but just to point out, he is a total hypocrite on this issue because he has a battalion of 9 of his own children that he knows of, because he is a serial philanderer who has been married, I think, 3 times, and also has more bastards than Henry VIII. But as I and plenty of other people pointed out, he packed us to the rafters with foreign nationals against the wishes of the electorate, and then is celebrating the decline disproportionately in white British people having children as a win for his depopulation agenda. He truly is beneath contempt. This is an issue that he's been fascinated with for years, by the way. I mean, here was an article back in October of 2007, writing in the Telegraph, global overpopulation is the real issue, but as we know, the blade of sub-replacement birth rates does not cleave evenly. It cleaves in one direction, and as research by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has advised, by the year 2100, there's only going to be 7 countries in the world, I think 5 in Africa and 2 in Asia, that are going to be above replacement birth rate. And so all Western countries are advised to just get their surplus population from there, with absolutely no consideration for cultural continuity, whether or not your civilization will survive if it's packed full of people that have no frame of reference for it, who do not revere its heroes and its history and its heritage, who do not, in their own cultures, have the concept of democracy or time or the future or words for maintenance, who do not have an individualistic morality and instead will lie, cheat and steal to advantage themselves, their family and their ethnic group, to save face, to farm Izzat. All of these things are not taken into account by people like Boris Johnson, who's part of the hypocritical global elite, who just looks at things in terms of spreadsheets, balancing emissions with the raw number of people that fit a pie chart or a bar graph in Excel, handed to him by the scientific experts that he let run the country on climate policy and during the COVID lockdowns. And he inherited this from his father, Stanley Johnson, who is just a reprehensible individual judging by how he treats his wives, has been writing about this for a very long time. Here's an article from Conservative Home back in 2015 where he said that the UK needs a population control policy. He spoke about it again on Newsnight on the BBC in 2018. I remember actually being at a net zero skeptic fringe event during COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, and we had the misfortune of sitting through one of the panels which Stanley Johnson was invited to chair, and at the very end of the panel, he squeaked in his pet project of depopulation by saying, and by the way, if we do want to reduce emissions, we need to lower the global human population. He didn't expand on how we should be doing that. I would assume if he's saying that we need a limitation on population growth, he's pursuing some sort of one-child policy that basically ruined the Chinese at this point. So these people are demented, draconian, do not have our best interests at heart, and don't exactly practice what they preach, because the Johnson brood is large and influential, whereas they're telling you to stop having children. Johnson himself, Stanley, has been writing books on this for quite some time. He wrote one about world population and the United Nations. Back in the 1980s, he wrote another, World Population Turning the Tides, 3 Decades of Progress. This is from 2001. He also conspicuously wrote a thriller about a virus and an intrepid politician fighting a global pandemic. Anyway, let's look at Boris's article in the Mail, because always have in mind what this man did to our country, you know, filling it full of foreign substitutions to depress wages and soak up the inflation that his government printed in stimulus and quantitative easing during COVID. Meanwhile, he is telling British people, and it's notable, this is the only time you see a white baby depicted, to have fewer children to save the planet. Quote, I've just returned from the Tuscan Hills, where the bells are tolling for far more funerals than weddings. The fact that he can retire to Tuscany after what he's done, rather than be rotting in a jail cell, is itself enough of a crime. A few months back, I was in Tokyo, where the kindergarten playgrounds were eerily deserted. Across the European continent, from Portugal to the Balkans, bus routes are being cancelled as waves of elderly customers take their last subsidised freedom pass to the sky. In China, the population is falling so fast, there are now miles of virtually uninhabited high-rise blocks built for families that never arrive. They also just do these, they create these ghost cities and then pull them down so that they have more economic activity on the balance sheet. So a lot of China's economic advancement past the West is a mirage, but anyway. In some of the provinces in India, the birth rate is so low by historic standards that schools are reporting zero intake. Okay, fair enough, there might be some good news here. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rate overall is still very high, 4.3 babies per mother, that number has slumped from 6 or 7 a couple of decades ago and continues to fall. As for the UK, once one of the fastest growing populations in Europe, the figures show that deaths this year will now exceed births for the first time since the mid-1970s. All of our population growth comes from immigration. It's about 1% per year. That's largely thanks to Boris Johnson's Boriswave. But what Boris doesn't dig into here is the fact that we know from the ONS census data that the birth rate gap between a replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, the 0.1 accounts for the fact that tragically some children die, or some children die earlier than their parents do, and the actual birth rate of the native British people versus immigrants is not quite the same. This is the latest data that we have. This is for 2023. In 2023, 31.8% of all live births were to non-UK born mothers in England and Wales. This is an increase from 30% in 2022. So again, thanks to Boris Johnson's immigration policy. 37.3% of live births were to parents where either one or both were born outside the UK, increasing from 35.8%. India remained the most common country of birth for non-UK born mothers and fathers, with Pakistan remaining second. So we are just repopulating Britain with the detritus of the Indian subcontinent. And I have seen so many videos over the last few days on my X feed of just the complete lack of self-regard and danger from people in India that makes me realise I don't want to turn into a Britain populated by monkey god statues and people who behave like characters from Looney Tunes. I just don't want it, thank you very much. I really, really liked the high trust, like beautiful, serene, peaceful and prosperous civilization that my ancestors built, that my grandparents and my parents grew up in, and I scarcely sought glimpses of in the early 2000s, and now my children will likely not see, thanks to the actions of this total traitor. Don't forget, we have a record abortion rate at the moment. We've had 10.7 million abortions at least since 1968 when it was made legal. And we have at least 10.9 million first-generation immigrants in this country. And that's not even counting the additional ones that have come in this year, the illegals. We don't know how many are actually here, but they number between 2 and 3 million. And also all of the second-generation immigrants who have been born with British passports. So the mass substitution of our population is just on unprecedented scales. And as for the abortion rate, that was something that was also made worse by Boris Johnson's government, because he allowed women, via the pills by post scheme implemented during lockdown, to get abortifacient pills in the post without a consultation from doctors, which then provided the casus belli for Labour politicians to push for the decriminalisation of abortion up to birth, which just passed. So the trend is only going to get worse because of decisions that Boris Johnson has made and remains unrepentant for. Anyway, Boris continues. He says, yes, we on this island are part of the trend. We're also going to peak much earlier than previously expected by the mid-century, with a decline thereafter. Yes, folks, it's unexpected, unimaginable, and now undeniable. The pessimists are calling it the Great Global Baby Bust, and of course it's causing some politicians to go into spasm. Yeah, I would quite like my civilization not to die out by the very fact of all of the people who care about it are going extinct, and they're being substituted by the people that you brought in as cheap foreign labour who have cultures of their own, who are still having children at much higher rates than the native populations. He also mentions about Georgia Maloney calling it a national emergency. I'm sorry, I'm not going to take lectures from Maloney at this point. She's become Italy's very own Boris Johnson, because she's just issued a few 100,000 worker visas for the third world. So Italy is getting its share of Camp of the Saintsification these days. So if Boris Johnson is trying to paint Maloney out to be his antonym, it's not all as it seems. Virtually every day I see a learned article in the Financial Times moaning about the demographic disaster and population crisis looming, and since I know that the Financial Times is a wonderful paper but wrong about almost everything, I say, phooey. This one really stings. This really stings, actually. Because if you remember, Dominic Cummings responded to Maven of Our Sphere last year. Oh, this was 2024. And Maven asked, why did Boris implement a points-based system and then saw legal migration skyrocket to record levels? Dominic Cummings said, quote, because Boris said, change the point system to open the floodgates because I want to make the friends with the Financial Times. Literal quote. So Boris Johnson inflicted the Boriswave on us because he wanted the Financial Times to like us again. And now Boris Johnson is saying, well, the Financial Times gets everything wrong, but remains unapologetic about the Boriswave and continues to insist that it was just doctors, nurses, and Hong Kong and Ukrainian refugees. As Aylmer points out in this excellent post, and he's now done a series of famous graphs about the Boriswave, we love our anons, folks. No, all of these policies that Boris Johnson introduced caused the Boriswave, and they were not, largely, Hong Kong and Ukrainian refugees. For example, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019. On the 1st of January 2021, Home Secretary Priti Patel introduced the new immigration system, which had the minimum salary threshold for the skilled worker visa basically on par with UK minimum wage. On the 1st of July 2021, they introduced the graduate visa, on which lots of students overstayed their visas and decided to apply for asylum. On the 15th of February 2022, care workers were eligible for the skilled worker visa. By the way, the care worker visa was advised against being introduced by the Migration Advisory Committee, who themselves were quite pro-migration back in 2018, because they said this will just be an economic disaster and will be exploited by lots of people coming over, bringing over more dependents than they can support. And hey presto, we see Nigerians bringing dependents at a rate of 2 to 1, Ghanaians at 4 to 1, and Zimbabweans, RIP Rhodesia, what a betrayal, at a rate of 10 to 1. Oh, and as Miriam Cates pointed out, I think it was in 2023, for the 70,000 care worker visas that were issued that year, only 17,000 vacancies were filled. So either they were bringing over loads more dependents, or lots of those care workers didn't actually stay in care work and just dropped out of the system and presumably went into the gig economy instead. And then Johnson resigned in 2022. After he left office, it continued to skyrocket. And you can see here with the orange line, once you deduct Ukrainians and Hong Kongers, net migration was still at 792,000, but when you keep them in, it's at over 900,000, and that means total inward migration, the overall population churn, is over 1 million every single year. That includes 250,000 Indians, almost 100,000 Pakistanis, thousands more Nigerians. Only the Chinese actually go home because they're largely on student visas. Boris Johnson added millions of people to our population that we never wanted here, and now he's celebrating the fact that British people are having fewer children than the immigrants. So he's celebrating our substitution and saying it should continue to preserve the climate. Oh, and by the way, I did it to make the Financial Times like me, but, the Financial Times seems to get some things wrong when they disagree with me. Totally reprehensible traitor. Anyway, he says, I say, crisis. What crisis? If we handle this well, as we easily can, this process of demographic stabilisation will be the best piece of global news for a very long time. And so he waffles on about climate alarmism, which at this point just makes my eyes glaze over, because what is the point of not speaking from an anthropocentric perspective? Like, what are we conserving the world for, if not for ourselves, our children, our posterity? So this entire misanthropic, anti-human degrowth agenda, I've just got no time for it. Again, also conspicuous that Emmanuel Macron here poses with one of the new French people who doesn't look quite so happy to be held by the Frenchman. He's not quite as happy as the other black chaps that Emmanuel Macron was hugging for photos beforehand. Anyway, Boris says, what we're seeing is not a crisis, but a sign that the human population is organically self-regulating, seeking a better balance with nature, a better quality of life. He capitalizes nature there as if it's some sort of deity. A recognition, among other things, that per capita productivity matters much more than brute national productivity. Wow, what a great realization, Boris. If only you'd had that while you were actually Prime Minister and hadn't flooded us with more raw bodies to grow the capita rather than the GDP per capita. After years of demographic strain, we are in sight of a demographic dividend, a blessing. The level of gaslighting is just outrageous. Again, 4 million people that he flooded us with, that we didn't want, that are not going to sustain our civilization, that have committed ungodly amounts of rape and murder. And he's saying, but because British people are having fewer children, this is a blessing. Just pure evil. The last thing we need, he says, therefore, is a load of tosh from the politicians about having more babies. Yeah, we need to sustain our population. We don't need infinite population growth, by the way. That's not particularly desirable, because that would be unsustainable. We need at least replacement levels of birth rates so that we don't die out. That's just simple. I mean, read Paul Morland's excellent work on this, on the economic, the civilizational, the all of the other problems that compound from having a sub-replacement birth rate. And also, the moment you don't have a replacement birth rate, you then get the sort of Jekyll and Hyde of the Conservative Party. So you've got Boris Johnson saying this is a great thing, and Fraser Nelson saying, no, it's a great thing that our population is growing from immigration. You get the Fraser Nelsons of the world saying, well, we're not having enough babies, Miriam Cates is right. But rather than encourage British people to have their own children, because the whole world is just a British person in waiting, we can just import the entire third world, not be able to tell the difference between, my Swedish wife and a Somalian drill rapper in social housing, and this will be all hunky-dory. It's actually a great benefit that the UK's population growth is purely because of immigration, unlike other countries across Europe who don't have nearly the level of net migration that Boris Johnson has subjected us to. So Boris Johnson cheerleads for you to have fewer children, which creates the conditions for Fraser Nelson to cheerlead for bringing in all of your demographic substitutes from the third world and destroy your culture. And also call you a racist if you object. None of these people should be in politics. None of these people should be in public life. They should be stripped. They should be put in the stocks. They should be have excrement thrown at them, and they spend the rest of their life in prison. That's not Restore Britain policy, by the way, but it possibly should be. Boris says, let all families, including mine, decide what they want to do, whether they want large families or small ones. But you're saying that it's a good thing, the populations are declining, and then your dad is pushing for a restrictionist demographic policy. So we see you exactly for what you are. It's up to them, and the state should not be finger-wagging either way, Boris says. Remember the Chinese one-child policy? Well, they now have a three-child policy. Both are hopeless. Above all, we don't want to be told by scaremongering politicians that we need more young people, locally born or imported, to do the jobs. Holy shit! That was literally your policy while in government, Boris, and you haven't apologised for it. He says, this is rubbish. We're constantly being told by the doom-mongers that AI will be doing millions of jobs in the future and making human beings redundant. Well, if that's the case, let AI strengthen and streamline the labour market without the need constantly to add to the numbers in the workforce. Oh, that'd be a great idea. As the head of BlackRock, Larry Fink, even said at the World Economic Forum, those who have not open their borders to mass, low-wage, third-world migration will be better placed to take advantage of the AI revolution because they'll have fewer people who are bone idle and likely to riot, and therefore have less of a universal basic income burden, if that's what the mental government decides to do. With what money? Yeah, that'd be brilliant if one Prime Minister hadn't have imported millions of those foreign layabouts into our country that are just going to cause trouble the moment they're put out of their Deliveroo job. Yeah, that'd be brilliant if someone hadn't done that, wouldn't it, Boris? This is just the arsonist showing up to the total ash heap that is your home and saying, well, these innovations in architecture means you can rebuild it in no time. And we'll employ a bunch of Indians to do it, which I just so happen to have brought here to do these vital jobs that the British people themselves couldn't have done. Thanks partially to the so-called hard Brexit, which gave us back full control of our borders, net legal immigration is now falling very substantially. Conspicuous omission there. First of all, not a hard Brexit. We were basically paying the EU alimony to leave. Thanks, Boris. But also, it's now falling sharply after the record increase to millions of third worlders that you did, Boris. And this is the most disturbing part. You're not going to believe he wrote this. What we need is now a prolonged period of assimilation, acculturation, and frankly miscegenation, so that the entire population acquires an equal sense of this country's language, history, and values. That's pretty disturbing, isn't it? So Boris Johnson brings in millions of third worlders who have been disproportionately raping white women, and now he says, well, to fix this problem that I caused, we don't need, deportations. No, we need higher levels of intermarriage among races. Now, again, on moral grounds, on the very edge cases where this does work, and unfortunately there's a much higher rate of abuse and divorce and things like that, but on the very edge cases where someone from a foreign tribe falls in love with someone of our tribe, okay, there's nothing morally wrong about it. But it's not desired by most people, because most people want their children to look like them. Like, I'm very happy that my wife is a beautiful English woman, and my children will be English. They're going to look very much like me. That's very desirable. That's something that pretty much all races like, which is why they rank members of their own race as the most attractive. So for politicians to then import millions of foreigners from halfway around the world who have disgusting, disturbing desires on our women and girls that they telegraph ahead of time, that the illegal migrants are enticed here by looking at our girls on a night out as if it's like a slave auction / travel brochure. Now, Boris Johnson's saying the solution to this crisis is to brainwash the public into marrying foreigners. So we can have one big beige country, and therefore our sense of selves as English people is diluted, and everyone therefore can buy into the British dream that Boris Johnson has blown apart. Bear in mind, Boris Johnson himself, despite having British ancestry, is also part Turkish and was born in New York. So he is a true anywhere man who is totally indifferent about the demographic security and the cultural continuity of this country. But this is just really gross. This is disturbing levels of social engineering. And again, he admits absolutely no fault for the predicament that we're in. So, anyway, he continues to just waffle. He says, the demographic trend offers the world and Britain a bright way of hope. This isn't a baby bust. This is a huge exaggeration. It is the first sign that the world's long, exponential, and environmentally disastrous baby boom may be finally drawing to a close. Rather than waste time and money trying to fight this trend, politicians should see and explain the vast potential upside. No, I want my people to have more children. I don't want my child to be a minority in their own country. I think that image of Roger Scruton at the Michaela School surrounded by the sons and daughters of the Third World is a vision of hell, actually. I know people of other heritages, and they're very nice, but they are, world historical characters. They're complete outliers, and we know this because when gathered in groups, people tend to act predictably, and that's why a country looks the way it does, and that's why when you bring people over from that country, they recreate the conditions of their failed third world shithole in our country. So I don't want that, actually. I think the people that Boris Johnson should brought here, and many of the people that were brought here before Boris Johnson, should be sent home. They should have their citizenships stripped. They should be ineligible for indefinite leave to remain. They should return to the countries that act, look, and behave like them. And instead, British people, as in the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, should have their own children, their own families, that they can pass along their inheritance from their ancestors to them, all the wealth and the treasures of our culture and the beauty of our land. British children should be inheriting that, rather than going extinct in their own country, either because their parents are having fewer children, because of climate alarmism like this, or economic pressures that have been heaped upon us by Boris Johnson, or because there is a bizarre vision of a universally grey people utopia that our technocratic elites have in mind for us. It's like in Ursula Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven, when everyone is grey and the only differentiating feature is whether or not you have a terminal illness, at which point the state police come along and euthanize you to presumably save money on the NHS. No, I don't think actually that state-mandated miscegenation via more black people in adverts or something, and an overall goal of depopulation is a good thing. I would like my society to be replenished, I would like my civilization to be thriving, and I would like my people to have a future. And my politics are whatever secures the future for my people. Thank you very much. And some of that politics will include throwing Boris Johnson in prison for what he's done.